Hello and welcome to MySecurityTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Tuesday afternoon episode. And today we're joined by Ekata, preventing fraud in the digital world with early and accurate detection. Joined by Dan Jiao, who's the Director Asia Pacific, and Niall Whelan, who's the Principal Field Data Scientist in the Asia Pacific also. And both of these gents are joining me in Sydney from Singapore. I believe it's raining both in Sydney and in Singapore, so at least we've got the weather right as well. Let me bring on Dan Jiao, the Director Asia Pacific, and Niall Whelan, a Principal Field Data Scientist, making sure our screens come up for Asia Pacific. Dan and Niall, welcome for joining, and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. And Dan, I think we'll start with you in terms of your role, Regional Director there for Ekata, and maybe introduce us to Ekata, and obviously what you do is in the fraud prevention field, and then we'll move in more of the deeper dive with Niall in terms of the data science aspects. So over to you, Dan, and a little bit more about Ekata.
Yeah, for sure. Some people might know Akata a lot more now. We're recently acquired by MasterCard. Yep. So we're happy to be part of them and complementing some of the cybersecurity and fraud prevention solutions that they offer to merchants, issuers, and payment acquirers. Akata already works with many of the leading ones across the Asia Pacific region. And what we really do is provide digital identity verification products that can allow our customers, whether it be during a digital account onboarding or during a transaction, to assess the identity risk of an individual, primarily for fraud prevention, but also more importantly, and which we'll talk about today, with being able to reduce friction, ensuring that those good customers get great experiences with your brand and can be able to interact with minimal roadblocks. So
well, I suppose sorry, go.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I'm happy to be here. I've been at Akata for 4 years, and I've seen our evolution grow globally. And with the partnership with MasterCard, it's an exciting time to be here.
When did the acquisition happen, out of interest?
The acquisition was formalized in June, finalized through the close.
So we're just on the back of that.
Yeah,
I didn't realize until I was just linking in LinkedIn. Coming up, and it was like our MasterCard company. Okay, I didn't quite know that. So it's one of those things of you link the two brands together, and that may change the nature of the business. Obviously, that explains a lot when MasterCard has acquired a company like Akata. And Niall, you're the data scientist, so if I can maybe say you're the brainchild there. Maybe talk us into your role as a data scientist, and you're relatively new with Akata as well. But yeah, just your focus, and then we'll dive into more the fraud sort of observations that we're making. But the role of a data scientist with Akata.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I've been at Akata now for about a year, and essentially the role of the data scientist here is to look at the problem we see with our clients and our prospects, identify what that fraud problem is, look at it in the broader scheme of things across all of our network, and leveraging our data to maximize detection of fraud, which is obviously important. We want to stop as much fraud as possible, but in doing so, making sure that we're not impacting good customers. We're not having a lot of false positives. We're not in a high friction environment. And so leveraging either rules recommendations, machine learning, in terms of the different type of modeling we would use to make sure that we optimize based on our customers' problems, and understanding that they can get the most from our data as well as in combination with their own data and other third-party sources.
Do you find it still evolving? There's still a lot more as the technology and the digital, and this was the title here, in a digital world. Those touch points from the data sets, it's quite an exciting time to be a data scientist in this particular field.
Yes, very much so. How you integrate the different types of data you can utilize, how sometimes they don't always combine so well together, and the challenges you face in that. Being a data scientist and be able to research that and do the analysis on it is really exciting. And the amount of data we have available now to leverage, keeps growing and keeps kind of going, but that comes with the challenges as well of just huge data sets.
I bet. Well, look, the other one, Dan, if you can, maybe your observations on fraud itself and the trends, and also the different types of fraud is something else we wanted to cover. But just your general sort of trends in e-commerce and payments, as I've got here in my notes, and the landscape of fraud abuse. General observations, because I wouldn't even know where to start on how wide or broad this is.
Yeah, for sure, Chris. And I'm sure everyone who's been listening to different types of webinars or thought leadership pieces wouldn't be surprised to hear that the COVID-19 pandemic we've been all going through as a society for the last year and a half has really accelerated the movement to digital channels, right? We're all starting to do our grocery delivery or food delivery on those channels. We're starting to do digital banking, and that's been accelerated quite a bit. So much so that, we've seen 50% year-over-year growth from 2019 to 2020, which brought the whole industry for e-commerce, as an example, to $4 trillion US. And that was something that we didn't expect to see happen until 2025. So to sum it up, it's 5 years of growth in 1 year time span, and that's how powerful this pandemic has been. Just for reference, in Australia, 36 billion Australian dollars for e-commerce last year. It's now become the 10th largest in the world, and now we know like large markets like China and Japan also are in that top 10 for e-commerce markets in Asia Pacific. One of the big trends I would talk about, and this translates really well in the fraud, is there's a lot of new people who are used to do retail brick and mortar, and they're starting to shop online for the very first time. As a reference, 1.36 million new online shoppers came online in Australia. In other emerging markets like Southeast Asia, 40 million new online shoppers came online last year. So what this typically means, Chris, is there's a lot of people now, and this is great for online business, but it also means a lot of people who get exploited. Their data is up for sale. They're tricked into phishing attacks where they might give up sensitive information. And this is usually what leads to the different types of fraud that we're seeing in the industry today, whether that be around stolen credit card fraud, someone trying to use your credit card for an unauthorized transaction. 85% of all card fraud right now is on card not present channels in most markets. And then there's even more advanced types of fraud occurring because now you're trying to offer convenience to your good customers, such as through click and collect. Buy online right now and then be able to go to the store and get instant fulfillment. This is great for customers.
Well, one of the things I wanted to click and collect, but also the promo abuse was another key area I wanted to cover as well.
Yeah, that would be the third type. So card fraud, click and collect, and then promo abuse is becoming a lot bigger now because in this race for these brands who are trying to acquire new customers for the very first time, this is very true for like on-demand marketplaces, like an Uber trying to compete against Lyft. In Southeast Asia, there's Grab and Gojek who are becoming super apps that offer fintech services and payments as well, where how they acquire people is they try to give an incentive. If you create an account with us, we'll give you $10 off your first purchase, or I'll be able to give you some type of rebate if you do more transactions with us. And this is great for good customers. All these features are wonderful. But then what the problem is there's abusers who can come in. It's easy to create an account now. You just need a phone number or an email address. And then if you can't verify that that's actually a legitimate Chris Cubbage or not, then you might be giving that away to the same person over and over because they're creating that same account. So it's a huge problem we've seen.
And what's the sort of the correlation there? There has been a rise in fraud, or is it the sort of the threat landscape just broadened and the fraud is the same? So more crooks entering the market going, well, hey, there's $1 to be made, or it's like shooting fish in a barrel. There's so many that the correlation of fraud rising as well as the fraud attacks and the money costing consumers as well. Is that being reported at the other end?
Yeah, I mean, fraud continues to rise by double digits each year. It's a growth economy. It's somewhere around $20 to $30 billion of US dollar losses per year. And just as a frame of reference, if you think about it anecdotally, the pandemic created a lot of hardship for people. So there were some people who were turning to fraud in order to ends meet. And that's
they're at home. What else we're going to do? I mean, and we have seen the same thing with the dark web as well. Like most people, well, sorry, not most people, but some people are accessing the dark web for the first time, and it's quite easy. Niall, I suppose from a consumer's perspective, you want to facilitate that e-commerce. You want to facilitate the click and collect. Might be people's first time, so you've got to make it as simple as possible. There's two questions I've got kind of in mind of. One, what should consumers be on the lookout for? And then the other one is, where does a company like Akata come in and go, okay, we are protecting you at certain points of that transaction? So maybe go with the first one. What are some of those red flags that a consumer might want to be looking at from the data sets?
Yeah. If you look at it from a consumer perspective, what you've seen is these massive phishing attacks. You've seen these kind of, I constantly receive calls every day where my bank apparently is calling me, and a lot of people are falling for this. A lot of people who are, not necessarily kind of overly savvy with kind of the type of attempts that are being made. And so that data is then being released, and obviously that's then being used on the far side by fraudsters. So really kind of, I think, being aware of kind of the type of attacks that are out there from a banking perspective in particular, you could be targeted. And also even as part of the pandemic, a lot of kind of in Singapore in particular, there are calls going around like Ministry of Health is ringing you up about your COVID vaccine. And a lot of people are falling for this. And a lot of data is being kind of accessed through this, not necessarily on the mass data breaches side of things, but more on kind of this, small scale phone calls and being leveraged from there. In terms of from the pandemic, in terms of the approach, in terms of how Ekata is kind of solving for that, as we see more and more people coming online and we see more and more of this fraud occurring, essentially a lot of the clients we work with are really struggling to differentiate these new customers versus kind of this potentially new customer or fraudster. They're not really sure. And leveraging, I think, some of the data sets around authoritative data, Ekata leverages a lot of what we call our graph database, which really looks to take data around telcos, credit bureaus, any authoritative sources where if I'm a good customer and I sign up to pay my phone bill every month, that's a really trusted indicator that this person is real. Fraudsters don't tend to do that so much. And so we're able to leverage this graph database to really kind of indicate trust and indicate kind of positive signals. That's one of the really key kind of attributes we have. The second one is acknowledging that you don't, say you're an e-commerce marketplace, you don't necessarily have the full picture of what this new person who's signing up for your account is doing. You may have no information, and that's a challenge. And really leveraging kind of this person could perhaps have been, on a data service recently, leveraging Afterpay, for example, could be leveraging a whole host of different, travel activity in the past that may be really relevant to their current circumstances, or maybe indeed be using banking services that may be really relevant in terms of having a bank account, having that information. And so it's leveraging that network of data to essentially take a bigger picture, the broader ecosystem picture of what this person is doing, and taking those data points to actually inform your decision based on the very little data you have, and essentially enriching that, enriching the feature set available to you.
So it's about anonymizing the data sets, because they don't need to know who you are in terms of your identity until maybe that point of payment, but everything around that should build up, as you say, sort of indicators of trust. And it's sometimes, I think, we've spoken to data scientists recently on Tech and Sec Weekly as well, where in fintech sectors also, where they don't need to know your name or necessarily your specific address, but your age is a good indicator of your behaviour, your sort of location of spending, as you say, paying that certain bill at the same time every month indicates that you are the person in control of that card. I had another question, maybe Dan, is to, I've lost it in terms of the implications of some of this, but you want to know that from a consumer's perspective, there's certain aspects that they do want to share in terms of their own data sets and have that level of trust that they have at that transaction level. What are some of the partners that you have in this? Do you have an ecosystem of partners that you work with and share certain information across?
Yeah, building upon what Niall mentioned, we have this identity graph, and the partners we have there are around data providers that we might work with. They might be telcos or utility companies that we can purchase data from. And then keep in mind, Akata and MasterCard's principle when it comes to identity verification is around privacy and security centric. Yeah. We only use this type of data for fraud prevention, which is in the legitimate interest of consumers like you and me to make sure that our information isn't being used for identity theft or card fraud or even promotion abuse. The other aspect of it too, it's really powerful, is we use an anonymized data set that comes from customer interactions. So you can imagine Akata has some of the leading global and regional players from e-commerce retail, travel, fintechs, buy now, pay later, issuing banks that all use our service. And the community effect that we create within what Niall mentioned is our network that allows us to essentially look at, hey, I've seen Niall use his phone number and email address combination at one day to open an Afterpay account. The next day, he's maybe booking a ticket with Qantas Airlines. and then the next he's doing e-commerce transaction through Amazon. So those are some of the key things when we work with partners. It can be our customers and it can be other data providers that are third party to us that help ensure we have the right data set to prevent fraud.
Well, the other one I've had, and I don't remember what the question was now as well, I've mentioned your partners. Who are your customers at the end of the day? You've got your consumers, but they're maybe not your customer. Where does Akata sit in the process? And who do the people you talk to in terms of your client base? Dan?
I can take that.
Oh, Neil? I was asking Dan, but otherwise you take it, Niall.
Sorry, I thought you had asked Niall.
Sorry, Niall.
Yeah, now I can talk about this. He works a lot with the users of our solution.
Got it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so go. Yeah.
Yeah, we essentially can cover a broad range in the industry, but essentially we can focus across e-commerce, fintech, and really anywhere where you're talking about opening an account, making a transaction, changing any details essentially on your information. So some of our key accounts in the Australia market, Afterpay, we've probably mentioned a couple of times now, several buy now, pay laters, Home Group is another example of that. E-commerce players that we work with, such as Meyer, Super Retail Group. So and really any of the banking institutions, obviously, at account opening. So minimizing your risk at that point to essentially anyone new coming in. So from that perspective, we really have a broad range of coverage. Globally, we work with some of the biggest players you can think of, Amazon being obviously one. And regionally, obviously, we focus on here in Southeast Asia, some of the marketplaces in particular as well. So Lazada will be one of our customers here where we do a lot of work with. So it's quite broad, but any of those risk points essentially.
And that takes us to the potential implications from their client perspective. What are you talking to clients about? What are the implications in terms of their risk profile and the business case for using sort of an Akata type solution?
Yeah,
Dan?
I can take that. I think when it comes to fraud, everyone knows about the direct losses. If you're taking credit cards, it could be a chargeback. If you're doing a loan, you lose the loan money. But the hidden cost behind fraud and the implications is really customer experience. That can be really high main review costs. You're having to have people look at your transactions or applications before you release them. And that can be a really detrimental experience, especially when companies like Amazon and PayPal are creating really frictionless one-click checkout experiences. The other piece of it too then is your false positives. There's a huge worry now that fraud systems are too conservative and overly tuned, where you might block customers that are actually legitimate, but your fraud system thought they were actually a fraudster. So those are like the two really key things, the main review as well as the false positives. You don't want to lose revenue from your good customers in the interest of security. So that balancing act is something we see be really critical here at Akata, but also with all of our clients that we work with each day to optimize their systems.
Maybe talk us through the sort of the last, we've split this up so because fraud prevention can be quite broad, but the friction reduction, you just mentioned you don't want a false positive on a legitimate customer. I mean, that's quite critical. In fact, that customer is probably not going to come back if they've been blocked. The step-up authentications, again, maybe this is one of those things that the customer should be aware of that authentication process so that they can trust you. And then if those authentication process, things like, what we see in cyber with multi-factor authentication, that should be normal when they're signing up to a new account. And if it's not, then that should be a bit of a red flag. And I like the term friction reduction and the customer experience. How do you create that balance there? What should the customer expectations be in that regard?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to from the risk. If you think about you as being an e-commerce merchant, you can think about it as anywhere really where you're looking to sign up for an account. You really want to put as little friction on as high a population as possible in terms of those good, positive kind of customers you expect. So, for example, if you're signing up for a buy now, pay later service, which essentially focuses somewhat on the lending aspect of things, you really are moving towards, can you get as many people through the account opening system with as little fraud as possible while putting as minimum kind of impact on those. So if that's like a national identity check, or if that's a two-factor authentication, a step up an OTP, Can you minimize that where possible so that me as the customer at the end result doesn't have to feel like this is an arduous task? I clearly, you know, a good customer here. Why do I keep having to do this? At the account opening, most customers will accept some friction. It's really when you start to have to do, you know, additional steps and over again, repeating kind of steps over again, tends to be really, really negative. What we also see at the payment side of things, so say when you're making a payment, and this is somewhat endemic in Singapore, is actually you'll tend to have to do a step up every time, even if you're repeating that transaction, if you're doing very similar transaction types. And that tends to be where, for me, coming from living in the UK until recently, that's a big kind of difference where every kind of payment is taking that step up. And actually, you know, can you reduce those step ups where possible? Because you don't necessarily need to continuously ask for the step up if actually you have a lot of information to indicate this is a very trusted payment event. So that's where we kind of look to see, can we minimize that and put customers through the right channel of friction. We essentially look to split customers out into different kind of risk profiles and then identify the correct level of friction to apply based on that risk profile, again, to minimize the fraud, but also to minimize the impact on those customers.
And that brings us to, there's obviously frameworks involved here. And again, we've got the CNP fraud mitigation framework. What are the sort of parallels? What are the sort of frameworks comparative to what you might see here in Australia, Southeast Asia, and maybe obviously the benchmarks would potentially be Europe and the US or elsewhere? Yeah, what are the parallels there in terms of the frameworks that your clients will be looking for and that you meet?
Yeah, for sure. Europe tends to be the leader when it comes to regulations around payment security. They have something called they call it PSD2, the Revised Payment Services Directive, which introduces the concept of SCA, which is just a fancy term called strong customer authentication. It's a way for you to verify with confidence through some type of two-factor authentication, something you know, something you are, might be a biometric, and something you own, it might be like a device.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that Europe has led the charge in making sure more payments are secure. There's less chargebacks and fraud when it comes to doing card payments. The same has happened now in Asia, starting with the Australia region. So there's the CMP card, the fraud mitigation framework that launched back in July of 2019. It started taking some enforcement by the end of the year. Essentially, what it benchmarks is that e-commerce merchants should look to be below 20 basis points or like 0.2% fraud rate for at least 2 quarters. And if they're over that for 2 quarters, then they would have to go and implement SCA, which is another way for saying friction, where you're going to require that customer to do a SMS OTP. And what we know right now, Chris, is 30% of customers, at least in Australia, drop off when they have to go through that additional authentication. Another thing that you mentioned with false positives, you know, what we know about the industry, I mentioned fraud is a $20 billion problem. False positives is 10x that. It's somewhere around $300 billion US per year of losses. And then what's worse is 30% of the time when you're a good customer being falsely rejected, you never come back to that retailer or that online business. You go to a competitor, and that's what's also evolving in our industry today. There's many options.
I think, well, that's the point, isn't it? In this particular space, there's many options for the consumer. So I really like the customer experience here in terms of fraud prevention and the I said it before, the friction reduction. I think it's critical. And it's something even we notice even in our business. Anytime you're dealing with someone on a digital platform, you have to make that experience as best they can. Well, look, we were time specific on this one. And the idea here is also to sort of set this up. We're going to do a deep dive with Ekata. And let me just bring this up here. Niall, we're going to do a deep dive on fraud prevention with a focus on customer experience. This is a webinar we got set up for the 15th of September. I'll put a link into the show notes as well. Maybe just briefly introduce us to what we're going to be covering off on this, because this allows, you know, anyone in this space that has either fraud prevention roles or responsibilities or is in e-commerce will probably want to have a look at this from a customer experience. And even if, you know, they're not interested in the platform, they should still understand that the customer experience here, really.
Yep, absolutely. Really looking forward to this session. Essentially, we're going to cover how to fraud detection, but really take that from perspective of things and actually see what is the impact you're having on your good customers and how you don't necessarily always need to make that trade-off. The different techniques you can use, some of them quite simple around how you reduce manual review and slowing down of orders, for example. Recently, we had a case in Australia where we were able to reduce the number of manual reviews by 50% by simply using one of the features Ekata provides. And actually, it's just looking at it from that system perspective and being able to essentially say, I can reduce customer friction, I can increase the experience, positive experience they will receive from this, while maintaining my fraud population, while reducing it possibly as well. Generally looking at that as being kind of the trade-off you don't necessarily always need to make. It's really a matter of leveraging your data and leveraging the information you have to its maximum.
And do you find that these days is the sort of people from customer experience will be the marketing, the comms teams, and then potentially even the sales teams. They have to have the sort of that validation strategy. They should be talking to their fraud prevention, their security teams, and their sort of chief information security officers on this side. And they do need to come together. I like the way that you talk about a customer experience and validation strategy. And that's what this session is going to be about, right? Where you talk about how that strategic approach to not just a single transaction, but also scaled transactions is probably more important.
Yes, absolutely. One of the big problems at the moment is the systems we have in place aren't really scaling, always scaling to the current situation, the massive increase. If you could imagine being a retailer who was a high street retailer until recently and suddenly having to take pretty much all of your transaction volume online, as an example, that's a huge shift. And so you really need to look at how you take your current system, improve it, and allow it to scale so you don't have this problem going forward.
Yeah, you don't want to find out you've got a problem after you've scaled and then you're getting those false positives which impact you. Well, look, on that note, we'll leave it there. We've done a good 30 minutes. And again, I thought it was I've got about 100 other questions, but I think we'll cover it off on the webinar session as well. And that was the intention here, but also to meet Dan, the regional director there in Singapore, and also Niall Whelan, the principal field data scientist for Asia Pacific. And Dan, maybe to close off in the region, any call to action that you've got, or even to our Australian audience, you've yet to potentially open office here in Sydney?
Yeah. We're in the process right now of opening up our local presence. We already have a lot of customers in Australia, so it's a lot of growth that we're seeing in that market, and we're hiring some of our first professionals to represent us in the market. We're building out a full go-to-market motion, and it's going to be in partnership with MasterCard, which I'm excited to see already starting up. So a couple of folks on my team that I'm hiring. You can go to akata.com if you want to see a little bit more about us, and you can go to the careers page if you're interested in joining us.
Great.
Yeah, we're growing quite rapidly. We started the Asia Pacific presence back in early 2020, and our headcount has been doubling very quickly, almost every 3 to 6 months. So
nice.
Yeah.
Well, we've also had quite a bit of interest in data science as well, and data scientists. So any of the data scientists listening or tuning in, I'll definitely reach out to Dan, but also Niall, and no doubt you'll enjoy the webinar session on the 15th of September. You can go to the mysecuritymarketplace.com. And it's there as a featured webinar session and course. So look, gents, thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it. We've been joined by Dan Jiao, the Director, Asia Pacific, and Niall Whelan, Principal Field Data Scientist for Asia Pacific with Akata. Gents, I'll put you backstage and I'll finish off our session. Thank you very much for joining us from Singapore.
Thanks, Chris.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Good on you. Thanks, guys. See you later.